With that in hand, I decided it was time to respond. I launched a Facebook page of my own, The Truth About Morrison Farm. The first post was a video that would go on to be the most viewed piece of content in Lakeside Estates history. I filmed it in Grandpa's cabin, his favorite coffee mug beside me. Calm, composed, and direct, I looked into the camera. "My name is Jake Morrison," I said. 3 days after my grandfather's funeral, Patricia Blackwood came to our farm with forged documents and false threats. She tried to take our land using intimidation and fraud. What she didn't realize is that I'm an attorney and I've spent years fighting this exact kind of abuse. The video included side-by-side images of the forged signature, original bylaws, audio from her threats, everything. But the heart of it came when I shared who Earl really was. For over 50 years, my grandfather helped this community. He never turned away a neighbor in need. Patricia Blackwood wants to erase that legacy so she can profit from it. Within 6 hours, the video had 75,000 views and over 2,000 shares. The comments were full of neighbors sharing their own stories of Patricia's bullying and threats. People who'd once stayed silent finally spoke up, and then came the breakthrough. A call from a law office in Billings. "Mr. Morrison," the caller said, "I'm David Chena, no relation to Tommy. I represent 4 families who've been victims of Patricia Blackwood's tactics. We've been building a case against her for years, but we need your help to finally bring it home. Are you in?" His evidence was devastating. Patricia had been running the same forged document scam across multiple neighborhoods. A broken bar continued. "If you'd like." Patricia had a pattern at targeting vulnerable HOA communities, especially elderly homeowners or families facing hardship. She'd fabricate violations, falsify signatures on new rules, and then push families into selling their homes far below market value or face crushing finesse money that mysteriously ended up in accounts she controlled. The scheme was so consistent that David had nicknamed her the HOA Vulture. As I ended the call, a realization settled over me. Patricia's attack on our farm wasn't personal, it was just routine for someone who had turned HOA corruption into a business strategy. But this time, she'd miscalculated. She had gone after someone who not only knew how to fight back but also had the legal acumen and connections to expose her entire operation. My phone buzzed. A new email. It was from Patricia, accusing me of defamation and demanding $500,000 in damages. The letter was clearly crafted by a professional, likely one of the high-priced PR firms she'd paid for with embezzled HOA funds. But she'd made a critical mistake as she had accidentally included an email thread about her Phase 2 expansion plan with a company called Pinnacle Properties. Patricia had just threatened a lawyer with a frivolous lawsuit and, in doing so, handed over direct evidence of her own criminal activity. In my world, that's what we call a career-ending move. That night, I found myself standing in Grandpa's bedroom, staring at the old oak wardrobe that had stood in the corner for decades. Patricia's email had included a reference to removing obstacles from the sacred ground slated for development, and I couldn't stop thinking about the old map I'd found in Grandpa's desk. He had always warned Martha and me to stay away from the back 40 acres of the property when we were kids. I used to think it was about safety and unstable terrain or abandoned mine shafts maybe, but now, I wasn't so sure. Martha walked in just as I began moving the heavy wardrobe. "Jake, what are you doing?" she asked, but her voice said she already had a feeling this was about Patricia. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about Patricia asking Grandpa questions about the land. What if he was protecting something back there, behind the wardrobe?" We discovered a small steel safe embedded in the wall, so well concealed that you'd never find it unless you knew where to look. It had an old-school combination dial that hadn't been touched in years. Martha and I tried different family birth dates before I finally punched in Grandpa's Army service number. The lock clicked, the sound echoing through the room. Inside, we found documents wrapped in oiled leather to preserve them, documents that turned everything I thought I knew about our family and Patricia's agenda upside down. The first thing I pulled out was a detailed, hand-drawn map far more intricate than the one I'd found earlier. It marked burial sites with traditional Lakota symbols, dating all the way back to the 1800s. Beneath the map was a stack of carefully written letters addressed to someone named Joseph Crowfeather. The letters, spanning over 4 decades, told a powerful story of friendship, trust, and a sacred promise that Grandpa had kept secret his entire adult life. According to the letters, Grandpa discovered the burial grounds shortly after purchasing the property in 1974, but instead of trying to profit or notify the authorities, he had reached out to the Lakota Tribal Council and vowed to protect the site. For 50 years, he honored that promise. He maintained the grounds, kept the location hidden even from his family, and allowed tribal elders to visit the site twice a year to hold private ceremonies. It was a sacred trust, and Grandpa took it seriously. At the bottom of the safe was a small USB drive wrapped in a note that read, "For Jake, when the time comes." My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. What I heard next chilled me to the bone. It was a phone call between Patricia and a man with a gravelly voice who identified himself as Richard Kane, CEO of Pinnacle Development Corporation. The date, October 15th, 2024, just 2 months before Grandpa passed. Patricia's voice rang out clearly. "The sacred burial site is just an obstacle. Once we get control of the Morrison property, we'll relocate whatever remains they're worried about. The tribal council might complain, but they have no legal authority. This is a $200 million project. Richard, we're not letting a few old bones stand in the way of Lakeside Estates Phase 2. Kane's response was even colder. "I don't care what you have to do, Patricia. Get me that land." We break ground in spring. By the time the recording ended, Martha was in tears. Jakey, a broken bar grandpa, knew. He knew this was coming. That's why he installed the cameras, why he was so on edge in his last days. He was trying to protect Thema even after he was gone. I held my sister close as the full weight of what Grandpa had carried all these years finally hit us. He hadn't just been a farmer, he had been a guardian. And Patricia's greed threatened something that couldn't be replaced. As if fate itself were listening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a calm, elderly voice said, "Mr. Morrison, this is Joseph Crowfeather. I believe you've found your grandfather's letters." Joseph explained that Grandpa had given him my contact information months ago, with instructions to call if the sacred site was ever at risk. "Your grandfather was a man of honor," he said. "He protected the site for 50 years. Now, it's your turn." I told Joseph everything about Patricia's plans, the recording, the emails. There was a long silence before he spoke again. "We'll come tomorrow. We'll perform the ceremony your grandfather requested in his final letter." He asked us to broken bar until his family understood. Then, more firmly, Joseph added, "What Patricia Blackwood is doing isn't just unethical, it's a federal crime. Desecrating protected Native American burial sites is punishable by law. And she has no idea what kind of legal storm she's just unleashed." I realized in that moment, Grandpa had been playing chess, while Patricia had been playing checkers. He spent his final year setting all of this up, had the evidence, the alliances, even choosing me as the executor of his plan. Every step was carefully prepared to make sure she would be held accountable. That night, with Martha beside me in Grandpa's cabin and 50 years of hidden truth around us, I called Tommy. "Tomorrow's going to be intense. I need you to research every federal statute on Native American burial grounds. Also, start tracing all financial connections between Patricia Blackwood and Pinnacle Development. We're about to show our lovely Hope president that some fights aren't winnable." At exactly 10 a.m. Saturday morning, Patricia called an emergency home meeting at the Lakeside Estates Community Center. Her Facebook post read like a movie trailer, "Join us for a special tribunal to resolve the Morrison farm crisis. The future of our community depends on your presence." She even hired a photographer to capture what she clearly expected to be her victory momento, a grand takedown of the troublemaking attorney who dared to defy her. But word of the tribal ceremony had spread fast, and not everyone was comfortable with Patricia's blatant disrespect for sacred ground. When I arrived, more than 250 residents were crammed into a space designed for half that number. The atmosphere was electric. Neighbors who barely knew each other were suddenly deep in heated discussions about property rights, ethics, and what kind of community they actually wanted to live in. Patricia had dressed for war. Clad in a sharp black suit, she looked more like a CEO than a neighborhood president. She stood behind a table stacked with official-looking documents and even had a gavel, as if she were presiding over a courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing through the room. "We are here to address a crisis that threatens our community values." For the next 45 minutes, Patricia delivered a theatrical speech worthy of a prosecuting attorney. She painted me as a menace, a slick outsider using legal threats and emotional manipulation to destabilize the community. She claimed my livestock operation was dangerous, my lawsuits were scaring the elderly, and that I had a hidden agenda to convert Lakeside Estates into a commercial farm. She had charts. She had fake testimonials. She had photos of goats that looked suspiciously exaggerated in size. And when she finally finished, she gave me a smug smile. "Mr. Morrison," she said sweetly, "would you like to respond?" The room fell silent. I stood up slowly and opened my briefcase. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood," I said. "I appreciate the opportunity to cross-examine the witness." Every word was deliberate. I wanted the room to understand. This wasn't a squabble anymore, this was court. "Mrs. Blackwood," I began, "are you familiar with the penalties for misusing HOA funds?" She blinked. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." I held up Tommy's report. Exhibit A, $18,000 of community funds used to hire Reputation, a defense a firm that specializes in online smear campaigns. Gasps echoed across the room. Exhibit B, I continued. Email correspondence between you and Richard Kane, CEO of Pinnacle Development, discussing a $2.8 million kickback in exchange for selling off community property. Patricia went pale. "Those emails are private," she blurted. "You had no right to." Exhibit C, I said firmly, cutting her off. "A recorded phone call in which you refer to Native American burial grounds as just an obstacle." I played the 30-second audio clip. Her dismissive laugh at the end drew shocked gasps and then fury. An elderly woman in the front row stood up. "You threatened to evict me if I didn't vote for you," she said, trembling. "You told me I didn't belong here." That broke the dam. One after another, residents stood up and shared their stories. Fabricated violations, coerced sales, extortion. Patricia's empire of fear unraveled right in front of her. And then came the final blow. I pulled out my phone and displayed a signed contract between Patricia and Pinnacle Development. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "your HOA president has already agreed to sell 75% of Lakeside Estates as a broken bar." The residents of Lakeside Estates were stunned to learn that Patricia had secretly negotiated a deal to sell the entire neighborhood, including the community park and the walking trails, to a commercial developer. In return, she'd receive a payout large enough to buy a mansion anywhere she pleased, while the rest of us would be left with constant construction, traffic jams, and the loss of everything we'd moved here to enjoy. The reaction was immediate. A wave of outrage swept through the crowd as chants erupted. "Patricia, resign! Patricia, resign!" The walls of the community center shook with the volume. Patricia stood behind her table, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. Finally, she screamed over the noise, "Fine, I resign as HOA president. But I'm suing you for defamation, Jake Morrison, and when I'm through, you'll have nothing left of your grandfather's legacy." I didn't flinch. I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd kept the whole time. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, "I look forward to seeing you in court, but you should know everything you've said and done here tonight was recorded. And threatening an officer of the court with a baseless lawsuit, that's never a good idea." Sure enough, exactly 1 week later, Patricia filed a defamation suit against me. She hired the most expensive attorney in Billings, a Richard Sterling, a $1,000 an hour shark known for intimidating small-town lawyers. She thought her money and connections would crush me. What neither she nor her overpriced lawyer realized was that the case had been randomly assigned to Judge Maria Rodriguez. 3 years earlier, Patricia had filed 17 separate complaints against Judge Rodriguez, who was then renovating her home. Patricia claimed the construction violated non-existent setback rules and pushed for fines that could have financially ruined most families. Judge Rodriguez had to spend over $20,000 proving she was completely within her legal rights. She never forgot what Patricia had put her through. On the other hand, I had worked closely with Judge Rodriguez years ago on major property rights cases, back when she was still practicing law. She knew me well and my integrity, my thoroughness, and my record. When I entered the courtroom, representing myself, she smiled warmly. "Counselor Morrison," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It's always a pleasure to welcome one of Montana's top property attorneys back to my courtroom." The look on Patricia's face at that moment was priceless. That country hick she thought she could bully turned out to be one of the most respected litigators in the state. Sterling immediately asked for a sidebar, likely to figure out how to withdraw from the case without looking like a coward. Judge Rodriguez, barely suppressing a grin, denied the request. When it came time for my opening remarks, I stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's lawsuit is a desperate attempt to silence someone who exposed her illegal conduct. I will be filing a counterclaim outlining 15 violations of state law, including embezzlement, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to desecrate federally protected Native American burial grounds." Sterling objected, but Judge Rodriguez overruled him. "Proceed, counselor," she said. For the next 2 hours, I laid out every shred of evidence Tommy and I had gathered: forged signatures, stolen HOA funds, secret contracts with Pinnacle Development, audio recordings of Patricia discussing the planned destruction of sacred burial sites, and her relentless harassment of elderly residents who dared to oppose her. By the time I was done, Sterling was frantically scribbling notes, whispering into Patricia's ear, his confident demeanor gone. Judge Rodriguez didn't hesitate. She fined Patricia $75,000 for misappropriation of community funds with interest and penalties. She ordered her to pay me $40,000 in damages and legal expenses. Most importantly, Patricia Blackwood was banned from holding any HOA position in the state of Montana for the next 15 years. The judge also ordered a full audit of every HOA Patricia had touched in the past 5 years. That investigation would lead to criminal charges in 3 counties, but the real victory came 6 months later. I stood on the porch of our family farm, taking in the changes that had transformed Lakeside Estates. Grandpa would have been proud. Our land had been officially designated a Montana State Heritage Site, permanently protecting the Lakota burial ground. Martha turned the old barn into the Sacred Grounds Cafe copyright, serving coffee and pastries to the growing number of visitors who came to learn about Native American history. Each month, Joseph Crowfeather and other tribal elders led ceremonies honoring their ancestors. The entire community embraced the cultural importance of what we were preserving. The HOA was restructured with new bylaws that encouraged cooperation instead of authoritarianism. I was elected president with 97% of the vote. Our chickens and goats became neighborhood mascots. Kids brought them treats. Retirees stopped by just to enjoy their quiet company. Patricia? She was forced to sell her mansion to cover the court's penalties and fees. Last I heard, she was living in a modest apartment 50 miles away and working as a receptionist at a tax prep office. Pinnacle Development quietly scrapped their plans for Lakeside Estates after learning about the federal protections tied to sacred lands. Several of their executives ended up facing their own legal battles over bribery and corruption. As I watched the Montana sunset turn the sky gold and purple, I felt something deeper than relief. It wasn't just about legal victories or proving a point. It was about honoring a promise my grandfather had kept for half a century. The sacred ground would stay sacred. The community had learned what real leadership looks like. And Patricia Blackwood had finally learned that some fights just aren't hers to win. That's when my phone buzzed with a new email. "Mr. Morrison," it read, "I represent a family in Malibu. Their 100-year-old chapel is under threat from an HOA president using forged documents. Her name is Catherine Walsh. We heard what you accomplished in Montana and wondered if you'd consider a consultation." I opened my laptop and began typing. Some people never learn, but Catherine Walsh was about to discover the same lesson Patricia Blackwood did. There's always someone bigger in the legal pond. Round 2 was about to begin. We all know that sinking feeling when someone in power tries to take what's rightfully ours. Whether it's a corrupt HOA president, a crooked boss, or a manipulative neighbor who thinks they're above the rules. Jake's victory proves one thing: knowledge, preparation, and grit can take down even the most arrogant bully. Your story matters, too. If you've ever stood up for yourself and want to tell us in the comments, hit like if this gave you hope, and subscribe to Happer Stories, where justice isn't just a dream, it's a promise we make to each other. Thanks for watching Her Stories, where the only thing stronger than the rule is a broken bar, is how we fight back. And just know we see you, we support you, and maybe next time, we'll be telling your story. The hardest day of my life at Lakeside Estates also happened to be the one that changed everything and made me the most influential person in the neighborhood. Just days after laying my grandfather to rest, while our family was still deep in mourning, she appeared, right there, in the middle of our yard. She pointed at the family farm that had been passed down to me and announced that it was going to be confiscated due to HOA violations. I imagine she thought I'd be an easy target as some fragile relative just stumbling through grief, too weak to push back. What she didn't realize was that certain occupations don't show up on mailboxes, and some people, when cornered, will respond in ways that leave you signing a resignation letter in a courtroom, under oath, from the very organization you once lorded over. If you're watching this while hiding out in a bathroom to dodge another painfully dull home meeting, leave a comment and tell me where you're camped out. Trust me, you're going to want to hear the rest of this. I'm Jake Morrison, and I just buried the man who raised me. Earl Morrison wasn't just my grandfather, he was my role model, my guiding light, and one of the toughest men to ever work the land here. His farewell ceremony drew folks from all over. That's just the kind of man he was, always ready to lend a hand, whether to a struggling farmer or a single parent just trying to make it through the week. He never asked for a thing in return, except maybe a cold beer on his porch come the weekend. After the service, I found myself standing alone inside his old cabin, the air still thick with the smell of tobacco and aged pine. The weight of what he left behind was immense. On his worn oak desk sat a pile of property deeds and a mountain of bills. But tucked away in the desk drawer, hidden beneath the paperwork, was something unexpected: an old, hand-drawn map filled with strange markings, possibly indigenous symbols. At the bottom, in his meticulous handwriting, were the words, "Sacred ground, a keep secret." I didn't get a chance to study it further. Raised voices outside drew my attention. They were loud, entitled, and absolutely out of place. Peering through the window, I spotted 4 individuals in identical polo shirts standing on our front lawn like they owned it. At their head was a woman with flawless blonde curls and a smile so smug it practically demanded to speak to someone's manager. That was my first encounter with Patricia Blackwood, self-proclaimed ruler of Lakeside Estates HOA, and even then, I could tell if this wasn't a friendly visit. I grabbed the new wireless security system I had just purchased. Grandpa always said to trust your gut, and mine told me I was going to need proof of whatever was about to unfold. I quickly installed 4 cameras across the property, linked them to my phone, and made sure they were all recording. Turned out to be one of the smartest things I've ever done. When I stepped outside to confront the unexpected visitors, Patricia turned on the phony charm. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice dipped in syrup. "I'm Patricia Blackwood, president of the HOA. So sorry about your loss." Earl was such a sweet old man. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was referring to an outdated pet that had finally been put down. I kept my tone even. "Thanks, but why are you here so soon after we just said goodbye to him?" Her facade dropped instantly. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glaring red document. "This is a formal notice of HOA violation," she announced, holding it out like a dagger. "Your property is in serious breach of community regulations." My confusion turned into fury as I read the paper. According to it, the presence of 15 chickens and 2 goats on our land broke some clause banning livestock in residential areas. We were being ordered to remove them or risk forfeiture of the land, along with a hefty legal penalty for damaging community property values. "This is absurd," I said, glaring up from the notice. "My family's been raising animals here for decades, as long before this HOA ever existed." Her smile turned vicious. "Times have changed, Mr. Morrison. Lakeside Estates isn't a farm anymore, it's an elite residential development. Your grandfather's rustic lifestyle may have been quaint once, but that time is over." Then I noticed something chilling. She somehow knew an awful lot about my personal finances, details no one should have access to unless they'd done some serious digging. She brought up my law school debt, the amount I'd inherited, even my salary. "How do you know all that?" I asked sharply. But she just ignored the question, pulling out another document. "This bylaw was added recently, and your grandfather signed the update. That makes you legally responsible now." The signature on the form looked like Grandpa's, but something felt off. "You've got 72 hours, she said, fake concern painted across her expression. "I'd hate to see you lose the family farm over something so preventable." She turned, then stopped to add one final twist of the knife. "And don't bother calling a local lawyer. My ex-husband is Judge Douglas Blackwood. No attorney around here would dare challenge me." As her little pack strutted away, I stood there clutching the violation notice, stunned. What Patricia didn't know, or what she never bothered to find out, was who she had just tried to mess with. "See, my business card doesn't say grieving grandson. It says Jake Morrison, attorney at law, specialist in land use and property rights. And I didn't just get my degree from anywhere. I graduated top of my class from Harvard Law, with a focus on exactly the kind of legal sleight of hand Patricia was attempting. But I wasn't about to tip my hand just yet. Sometimes it's better to let your opponent feel smug while you gather your evidence. And Patricia had just declared war on someone who actually knows how to fight. Even better, I had every second of her threats caught on high-definition video. As I watched her luxury car disappear down the road, I pulled out my phone and dialed Tommy Cheetah, a friend from law school, now a forensic tech consultant in Seattle. "Tommy," I said, "I need your help analyzing the signature, and we might need to take a deep dive into some HOA regulations that reek of corruption." He picked up right away, already half focused on whatever he was working on, but the second he heard the story, his tone shifted. "Send me everything, digital copies, original forms, all of it. If someone's playing dirty with legal documents, we'll expose them." While Tommy got to work, I went hunting through my own records. I wanted to verify the date Patricia claimed Grandpa had signed the new bylaws. Something didn't sit right. Then I found the call log from my sister Martha. She'd phoned me crying, telling me how Patricia had been harassing Grandpa, calling constantly, pressuring him to sell the land. I rang her back. "Jake, thank God," she answered, exhausted. Martha had been working nonstop as a nurse while also helping care for Grandpa near the end. "I can't stop thinking about what that woman put him through," she said. And with that, I knew I wasn't just dealing with a legal issue. I was fighting for justice for my family, for our land, and for the man who raised me. And Patricia Blackwood was about to find out exactly what happens when you back the wrong person into a corner. "Jake, I can't stop thinking about what that woman said today," Martha said, her voice trembling. "Grandpa never mentioned signing anything about new HOA rules." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Back in November, she called him more than 20 times. He was so weak, Jake, but she kept hounding him about the land behind the house. He told me she kept asking if anyone ever went back there, like she was searching for something specific." That part hit me like a jolt. The land behind the house was the same area marked with tribal symbols on Grandpa's hand-drawn map. I tried to steady my voice. "Did Grandpa say anything else about those calls?" There was a pause, then Martha said quietly, "She offered him $200,000 for the whole property on December 20th. Jake, you and I both know this land's worth at least $650,000. When he said no, she got real nasty and told him he'd regret turning her down." As I scribbled down notes, a disturbing timeline began to form. December 15th, the supposed signing date of the revised HOA bylaws. December 20th, Patricia's insultingly low offer is rejected. December 28th, Grandpa dies peacefully in his sleep. December 31st, Patricia delivers the violation notice. Too convenient, too clean, and way too suspicious. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from Tommy. "Jake, check your email. You're going to want to see this." I opened my laptop and stared at the report Tommy had sent. The digital signature on the so-called bylaw update? A forgery. It had been pieced together using a scan of Grandpa's real signature from his will and photoshopped onto a completely separate document. The pixel density was inconsistent, and the date was typed in a different font. Sloppy work, but passable if no one was looking too closely. Before I could process the weight of that revelation, my phone rang again. "Unknown number. Is this Jake Morrison?" asked a soft, elderly voice. "This is Eleanor Fitzgerald, from Maple Street. I think we need to talk about Patricia Blackwood." Mrs. Fitzgerald had lived in Lakeside Estates for over 15 years, and what she told me chilled me to the bone. She did the same thing to the Johnsons in 2022, she whispered. Claimed their vegetable garden violated some nonsense aesthetic standard. They couldn't afford a legal fight and had to sell for half what their home was worth. She listed more names: the Martinez family, the Simons, all forced out by similar schemes. But there's more, she added. Patricia's been bragging in her book club about cleaning up the neighborhood. Said your grandfather's land was the last thing standing in the way of her vision for Lakeside Estates. I was reeling from the flood of information when my computer pinged with a new Facebook notification. Patricia had just gone live on the HOA community page. I clicked the stream. She was already mid-performance, standing in front of her fireplace, a tasteful portrait of the neighborhood behind her. My dear residents, she began, voice trembling with carefully rehearsed emotion, I'm heartbroken to report that the Morrison family is refusing to comply with our agreed-upon community standards. Their livestock are unsanitary, damaging property values, and is sadly turning our neighborhood into a barnyard. The comments were coming in fast, some in support, others questioning her motives. But what stood out was how coordinated it felt, like Patricia had primed her little echo chamber in advance. She even managed a tear. I don't enjoy being the bad guy, but sometimes leadership means making hard choices for the greater good. I recorded everything: screenshots, video backups, comment logs. She was handing me evidence on a silver platter. Moments later, another text from Tommy lit up my phone. More in your inbox. You're going to love this. I opened the second file and immediately smiled. Tommy had traced the forged document to Patricia's personal computer down to the hour it was created. The so-called signed bylaws were drafted over a week before the alleged signing date. Even better, her search history. Tommy had recovered cached browser data showing she'd been researching things like legal loopholes for forced property sale, how to strip grandfathered land rights, and Montana HOA enforcement limits. This wasn't a sudden burst of authority. This was a premeditated attack. As I sat in Grandpa's old cabin, surrounded by his papers and the scent of aged wood, something ignited in me I hadn't felt since law school, the thrill of a winnable war, one where truth was on my side, and justice wasn't just possibly, it was inevitable. Patricia Blackwood had tried to pull a fast one on the wrong man. She just declared war on Montana's top property litigation attorney, and I was about to show her exactly why that title wasn't just for show. The deputies arrived with a county animal control officer in tow, along with a woman carrying a camera, clearly there to capture Patricia's big moment, dressed like she was about to lead a corporate board meeting, clipboard in hand and that same smug, predatory grin she'd worn days earlier. Patricia looked every bit the victor she expected to be. She thought this would be a swift, one-sided win against some clueless farm boy who didn't know the law. What she didn't count on was the crowd. Nearly 80 neighbors had shown up, drawn by a mix of curiosity and outrage. Word spreads fast in tight-knit communities, especially when someone publicly threatens to seize a neighbor's property on live stream. I'd spent the previous evening on the phone, and it turned out Patricia had no shortage of enemies. Folks had stories plenty of them, and they were eager to see how this little showdown would unfold. I stepped out to meet the group carrying a leather briefcase filled with everything I needed to dismantle Patricia's little empire. The deputies looked uneasy, probably because this situation was clearly not the simple animal removal they'd been led to expect. Good morning, officers, I greeted them calmly. I understand there's been some misunderstanding about the property rights here. I'd like to resolve this quickly and professionally. Patricia stepped forward, raising her clipboard like it was a sword. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Morrison, she snapped. These officers are here to enforce a legitimate HOA violation. Your livestock violates community standards. She gestured dramatically toward the chickens pecking harmlessly at the grass. This is exactly the kind of backwoods nonsense that's destroying our property values. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the first document. Before anyone proceeds, I'd like you to review this deed. I handed the deputies a certified copy of the original 1974 property deed, complete with the county seal. The Morrison family has owned this land for over half a century, long before the Lakeside Estates HOA ever existed. Under Montana law, our livestock operation is legally grandfathered and exempt from any HOA regulations passed after that time. Patricia's confident expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "Your grandfather signed the revised bylaws this past December. His signature is right here." She brandished the document as if it were irrefutable. "Interesting," I replied, pulling out document number 2. "This is the original 1995 Lakeside Estates HOA charter, officially filed and untouched until the so-called amendment made in December 2024. As you'll see, the original bylaws contain no livestock restrictions whatsoever." I handed copies to the deputies and made sure several neighbors could read along. Patricia opened her mouth to argue again, but I cut her off with document number 3. "Yes, let's talk about those December bylaws," I continued. "Officers, I'd like you to take a look at this forensic report. It includes side-by-side comparisons and pixel density analysis." I held up Tommy's detailed analysis. The signature allegedly belonging to Earl Morrison was digitally copied from his will and photoshopped onto this HOA document. In plain terms, it's a forgery. The silence was immediate and beautiful. Patricia looked like she'd just been struck by lightning, trying to process what had just happened. She wasn't a confident HOA leader anymore. She was someone who had just been exposed for fraud, standing in front of 2 law enforcement officers and a crowd of nearly 80 witnesses. Sheriff Martinez, a weathered veteran of the department, studied the documents and then looked at Patricia with a mix of irritation and disbelief. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this looks like a civil dispute and not a law enforcement issue. We won't be seizing any property today." He handed the papers back to me, then nodded to his partner. "Let's go, we've got real crimes to handle." As the deputies turned to leave, Patricia's face cycled through a spectrum of color: red from embarrassment, white from shock, and finally a deep, blotchy purple that made me worry about her blood pressure. "This is a setup," she yelled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's lying. He's faking the evidence." That's when Reverend Samuel Hayes stepped out of the crowd. At 70 years old, Reverend Hayes had served as our community's moral anchor for decades. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the weight of generations. "Patricia," he said gently, "I need to say something. Last week, you came to my church asking how to convince someone to sell their land. You mentioned Earl Morrison by name and asked about legal strategies that might pressure him into a sale." The crowd buzzed with whispers, and several phones came out, ready to record what was becoming the neighborhood event of the year. Patricia's polished image crumbled right before our eyes, and she knew it. "That's not what I meant," she stammered. "You're twisting my words." "Ma'am," I said clearly, stepping closer so everyone could hear, "you can call me Attorney Morrison, Jake Morrison, Montana State Bar number 47291. I specialize in land rights and property disputes." I paused, watching her face register the shift. "Yes, the same Jake Morrison who graduated top of his class from Harvard Law." Her expression shifted from fury to fear. "You made one fatal mistake when you came after my family's farm," I continued. "You assumed I was just some grieving grandson without the means to fight back. You should have done your homework." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. "Everything you've said and done here today was recorded by multiple security cameras and will be submitted as evidence in the legal proceedings that follow." As the crowd started to drift away, chatting about what they just witnessed, Patricia grabbed my arm and hissed, "You think you've won? I have resources you can't imagine. I will ruin you in ways you haven't even dreamed of." "This isn't over." I gently removed her hand and smiled. "Mrs. Blackwood, just a reminder, threatening an officer of the court isn't usually considered a wise move." Unbeknownst to her, the cameras had captured that threat too, and I already had plans for it. By that afternoon, Patricia had launched a full-scale digital assault. She created a Facebook group called Save Lakeside Estates from Farm Pollution and somehow recruited over 400 members in less than a day. It seemed impressive until Tommy did a quick dive into the data. Nearly 60% of the profiles were fake, created within the past week with stock photos and generic names like Patricia Smith and Bob Johnson. It wasn't a sloppy job, either. Patricia's campaign was coordinated, deliberate, and clearly guided by someone with PR experience. She wasn't just trending about livestock, she was framing me as an outsider, a manipulative lawyer using legal loopholes to harm a peaceful community. One post read, Jake Morrison claims he's a lawyer, but real lawyers don't ambush neighbors with legal traps. He's deceived us for years and now uses his legal training to bully honest families. The comment section was a cesspool of fake outrage. Dozens of bogus accounts posted scripted talking points. My chickens were spreading disease, my goats were dangerous, and my legal strategy was terrorizing retirees. But what really stood out was how polished the whole campaign was. Slick hashtags like #Lakeside Safety and #Stop Farm Terrorism, clearly crafted to go viral locally. When I mentioned this to Tommy during our nightly call, he laughed. "Jake, you won't believe what I found in the HOA financials." Tommy had spent the day combing through publicly available financial records. Patricia paid $18,000 of HOA money to a company called Reputation Defense LLC. They're a crisis PR firm for the rich and shady. She used community funds to finance a personal smear campaign.